Hello everyone, welcome to the first episode of Caro Kann opening series. I believe the reason you click on this video is to avoid heavy theory when playing as black, and I hope to help you with the journey. Today I'll be talking about one of the most solid opening to play as black against pawn to e4, but yet not a lot of theory to memorize, so you can still be very flexible on your move. And we'll also be talking about the opening from black's perspective, because Caro Kann is something only black can do against pawn to e4. There is really no way that stops the pawn from coming to c6 if black wants to move his pawn to c6. And so the idea of this opening is really to push the pawn to d5, to push the pawn to d5 with the support of e6 to claim that you have the control over the d5 square and over the center of the board. It does not even matter if white plays pawn to d4 or knight to c3 in this position. Black will respond with pawn to d5 to then control the center of the board, to control the light squares essentially. And later on at the right time you want to bring your bishop out to control the whole diagonal over here and play pawn to e6 to then solidify the whole pawn chain and also the pawn structure, and essentially to claim that you have control over d5 square. Now let us just see what it means. Now white has multiple options as far as how he can continue. Mainly pawn to e5 is one move, knight to c3 is one move, and then pawn takes d5 is also a possibility in this position. But today in this video we're just going to talk about the move knight to c3, one of the most common and also the oldest main line that exists in Caro Kann opening, with the straightforward idea of taking on e4 when the pawn captures on e4. Black in this position does not have any better move, so he just takes on e4. Of course, if he just develop his knight to f6, there's pawn to e5. That's not going to be very good. And so after capture onto the center, we usually bring our bishop to f5, attacking the knight, controlling the whole diagonal. Of course, the knight wouldn't want to go back to c3 because that's the square that he just came from. And so in this position, what usually does knight to g3, attacking the bishop, just gaining a tempo, and after bishop to g6, then develop the knight to f3 quite normally. So this is the typical structure of Caro Kann with knight to c3. This position is played by many grandmasters, Hikaru Nakamura to name a few, Vladislav Artemiev, or people like to call him the Chuck Norris from Russia, the Frenchman MVL, Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, and also just many more. And also it's just very solid opening to play, that you can actually just use it against a higher rated opponent without much trouble at all. Now you still have to do the right thing, but as far as the opening continues, black can do a lot of things right here, that is including pawn to e6, knight to d7, knight to f6. Black has a lot of choice to continue right here, but the only choice that is not available is pawn to h6, because after knight to e5, you would like to move your bishop away, but after you do that, you have queen to h5, and then it's threatening checkmate. You can play g6, but then there's queen f3, threatening a checkmate. Here on f7, and then after knight to f6 you have queen to b3, and then that's also threatening the checkmate, not to mention this one, the pawn on b7 is hanging. And so it's quite obvious that h6 might not be the very best move to play in this position, but let's just say you continue with pawn to e6 to actually have a control over the d5 square, controlling some of the light squares over here, preparing to get the bishop out. You can still meet pawn to h4 at this point because the bishop is so strong. White is just trying to do this. But seriously, it has become the theory to kick away the bishop that is sitting on g6 because it controls so many squares along this diagonal right here. And so of course the correct move to play is pawn to h6, trying to preserve the bishop. But even here there's trap that beginners can fall into. I've seen many beginners fall into this kind of trap. It's the very same trap that we actually saw earlier with knight to e5, and after bishop to h7, let's say, we can see queen h5 from our opponent to actually threaten checkmate on f7. The same thing kind of occurs with g6. After queen to f3, we see, knight to f6, try to defend our checkmate idea. Right now, there's no queen to b3 in this position to attack the pawn on f7 and also b7 at the same time. But white here has a very nice move. He plays bishop to g5, attacking the knight. And if you protect it, there's knight to e4, and you'll be just losing a piece. And if you take on g5 and take on g5, this knight still cannot move because of the checkmate idea that we see earlier, right? This is a checkmate that black can find himself falling into. Not to mention that the bishop is just blocked here on h7, which is a very terrible position for black, if you ever get into this position, of course. And so if there's a beginner watching, I actually just want to emphasize a little bit on this little trap that you might find yourself. The correct move in this position is to play queen to c7. This prepares to protect against the checkmate idea. It prepares knight to f6 to kick away the queen. And if black wishes to, he can bring his knight to d7 and castle on the queen side. Of course, he can also castle on the king side after bringing the bishop out as well. And if queen h5 is just a trap for a beginner, well, what does white usually do then in this position? What usually will do? Bishop to d3. Still very keen on trading off the very strong bishop that is sitting on h7. And just because the bishop here on h7 doesn't have a retreat square, more often than not you will see that black actually traded off that bishop on d3. and after queen to d3, you will notice something that is very bad for black, which is the underdeveloped pieces that is sitting on the 8th rank over here. White has 3 pieces being developed, namely 2 knights and 1 queen, while black has none of his pieces developed. They're all on the 1st rank or being traded off. And so in this position, I'll always recommend the black side to play knight to d7, and this idea is to trade off the knight as soon as possible. As you can see, this knight is the most developed piece from white, and if white doesn't know the line, if you trade off like this, then it'll be pretty good for us. I mean, we get our queen out, that's 1 piece for us, and 2 pieces for white. That should be, we should be very good in development right here. Of course, knight to f6, also a very fine move, although still you have to deal with 3 pieces being developed versus 1. Bishop e7 is fine, but the one move that is not fine is knight to e7, because it blunders checkmate with queen to f3. This is again threatening another checkmate. And we might have established that, Caro Kann is a solid opening, but if we blunder mate in 1, then probably that's not going to be very good as well. But I would recommend all players to play knight to d7. This threatens to trade off the knight on e5, which is the more advanced piece from white's side. More often than not, you'll see white trying to protect this knight on e5, but even with bishop to f4, I think it would be very nice for us, because after knight to e5, pawn takes e5, we can trade off the queen, and of course we just traded off, some of the strongest pieces, which is the queen here that is on d3, aiming on the king's side. And after bishop to e5, we can just insert a very sexy move, which is queen to a5. This develops our queen, also giving a check to the king, of course. If queen to c3, which is a blunder, we play bishop to b4. I think this is obvious for us all. But even if pawn to c3 is played, the idea of queen to a5 is to block the king from castling on the queen side. Once castle on the queen side, the pawn a2 is going to hang. And so let's just put an example. If knight f6 from black, the castle's on the queen side, this pawn on a2 hangs. And so what we usually castle on the king's side. But if he castles on the king's side, then he will not be able to push this pawn from the king's side to attack our king's side, because of course it's just going to weaken his king, because this king is going to be naked without this pawn protecting them. Now there's another way to protect this knight here on e5, and that is pawn to f4. But in this position as well, I'll recommend a theoretical draw move, which is bishop to e7. This is easier to play. Of course here there's knight to f6, and after that bishop to e7, castle on the king's side. But the line of bishop to e7 actually attacks the pawn on h4. There isn't a way to protect that pawn. And so the theory will be actually just giving up this pawn with bishop to d2, preparing a castle on the queen side. Black, before capturing on h4, will actually take on e5 to avoid any shenanigans that is happening on the queen side. And after pawn takes on e5, we do see bishop to h4, castle onto the queen side. In this position, black is not recommended to play bishop to e7 because knight to h5. Attacking g7 will be forced to play king f8 and or bishop to f8. Both are not pretty good. And so usually we'll just trade off this knight. And after this, you can see that the queen is attacking this. There's no way to protect this, so you play knight to e7, sacrificing the g7 pawn. But this is okay, because after rook to g8, we're also threatening to take the pawn on g2. After queen h7, we can see queen to d5, threatening to take a2, threatening to take g2 as well. And many grandmasters have reached this position to actually just have a equal balance game and reach a drawn endgame. The sample line from white will include rook to f1, and after even castle on the queen side, rook to f7, we can even just play rook to g2, hanging the knight on e7, because after rook to g7, the rook on h1 is hanging, and there's no time to take the rook on g7 because this is just checkmate. And so the only way to protect the back rank and also the queen is to play queen to h6, where after rook to g7, bishop to g5, rook to e8, rook to d7, doesn't matter. We can just take the exchange. This will be a drawn endgame that many grandmasters have actually reached into. Of course, if you don't want the theory, knight to f6, a simple development move, will be fine as well, with bishop to e7, castle on the king side, pawn to b5, pawn to e5 to attack on a queen side is also an option for you to go to in this position. The other possible move for white is pawn to h5, attacking the bishop on g6, gaining space on the king side, and after the bishop moves to h7, it is still possible to play bishop to d3, exchanging off the strong bishop on h7, and after the bishop exchange here, we can even just play knight to f6, bishop to e7, castle on the king side, and everything will just go back to a normal Caro Kann position. And so this is the general framework that you will need on Caro Kann position. Hopefully you can find this video very useful in your training games. And as usual, I'll quickly wrap up this video for us to actually head on to review games played by Grandmasters. And as always, if you like this video, please consider subscribing to this channel as a support to motivate me to keep going to post this video about the opening and also just in general about chess. Otherwise, thanks for watching. See you soon.